Rousseau and Contradiction. The philosopher of the general will is not likely to be the favorite political thinker of an age of microgroups and new social movements, which, along with so many other political philosophizers nourished by the classics, he would have considered to be so many factions. So, within the history of the 20th century, he is most likely to have been characterized as totalitarian. But there are other Rousseaus, and indeed other Jean-Jacques. Sparta may have been totalitarian in some rather different and unique way, but the simple and hardy pastoral villages of which Rousseau also dreamed are perhaps rather to be described as regressive. And as for the famous state of nature, so often wildly misconstrued, it is better to follow Claude Lévi-Strauss in considering it a contribution, the first and most glorious, to the scarcely even nascent discipline of anthropology. Meanwhile, Rousseau's self-portrait was so decisive in fixing an image of his subjectivity for all time, and, like any image, it is only that, a construction, that we may well have some difficulty in taking seriously the thinking of an autodidact, a dreamer, a masturbator, a paranoid, and a pretentious imitator of antiquity. I want to argue that we can learn much that is useful about thinking and reasoning politically from Rousseau without in any way having to endorse his ideas or opinions. Indeed, I see that as the purpose of any reconsideration of political philosophy, namely to identify the form of genuine political thinking, whatever its content, in such a way that we can rigorously separate the political text from expressions of mere opinion or ideology. This is, to be sure, not a very satisfying approach for those, and I admire them, who feel that our duty and our vocation as intellectuals lies in the identification and denunciation of right-wing or even liberal positions. My own skepticism and pessimism are, however, so all-encompassing as to make me feel that such an approach has little chance of teaching us anything new or surprising. So I will not unmask or denounce Rousseau today, although it is worth pointing out how uneasy his critics have always been, how ambiguous their judgments, how unsettled a place he continues to occupy in literary or philosophical history. He has been as embarrassing for the Marxists, was he not some kind of predecessor, as for the fascists or the liberals. Only Jacobin Republicans have given him pride of place in their national pantheon. So perhaps the paranoid Jean-Jacques was right after all, and his greatest achievement was to have been loathed and attacked by all sides. After that, it always comes as a shock to remember those slashing formulas by which Rousseau stunned the age and planted a dagger in its heart. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, "This is mine," and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. These astonishing sentences, which only Rousseau could write, on the mode of declamation, are, it should be noted, temporal in their ambition. They aim to isolate, identify, and make dramatically visible not so much a fundamental event as a fundamental change. That change can also be said to be the beginning of history, or what is for Rousseau the same thing, the beginning of civilization, the beginning of something which, for him and for Lévi-Strauss following him, had accidental causes and need never have happened in the first place. And indeed, we know today that it did take a very long time to happen, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, compared to which our own history and civilization is a mere flash in the pan. Is a society without the state also a society without politics? In that case, it is the beginning of the political which is also at stake here. And I will not review the literature which, from the 1960s on, from Pierre Clastres to Michael Mann, has sought to solve the riddle and answer the question of the mechanisms whereby human beings were able to avoid state power for so long. In a way, Rousseau is less interested in solving the problem than in posing and articulating it. But we'll come to that distinction in a moment. And perhaps I should also add a historical observation, that the classical tradition, from Plato to More, from Locke to Fourier, always firmly identified the coming into being of so-called civilization with the coming into being of private property. But in the contemporary period, and not least in the modern Marxist tradition, civilization has been associated with power, and with state power at that, rather than with property or private ownership. It is, on my view, a momentous distinction, and ought to have its relevance in the definition for us today of the political. I don't want to lose sight of Rousseau, however, and particularly of his texts, of his sentences, which must somehow for us today be inseparable from his thinking, and offer a more reliable object of study than those philosophical positions and ideas in which only idealists still believe. I would therefore want to say that the analysis of Rousseau's political thinking must somehow be inseparable from the analysis of his style, except for the palpable fact that with Rousseau we have to deal not with style, that modern, personal, idiosyncratic appropriation and production of language, but rather with rhetoric, and with the clumsy and grandiloquent imitation of ancient rhetoric at that. Who does not hear the oratorical accents of Rousseau's declamations, of his great rhetorical periods and perorations, of the grandiloquent egotism with which the speaker announces his intent to take a stand on all the great problems of the age? This eloquence is not personal. Indeed, the only personal feature of this language is the awkwardness and self-consciousness of the classical imitation, while Rousseau's ideas, virtue, freedom, Sparta, self-sufficiency, physical hardiness, etc., are the baggage the classical or rhetorical sentence carries within itself. Another generation or two, and all this will be swept away by Romanticism. But now I need to say what is truly original, historically original, with Rousseau. And I suppose that in the history of ideas it bears the name of enlightenment or reason, or one of those periodizing labels that have little enough to do with texts, and a lot more with ideology or opinion in their most general sense, or with those peculiar fictive entities called values. Thus, enlightenment has something negative to do with religion and superstition. Reason is another word for secularization, and so forth. What I have in mind is not reason, however, but reasoning. And when we look at it more closely, we may find ourselves drawing closer to Rousseau's own opinion, namely, that he has little enough in common with the other philosophes. Let's look at a specific passage, that climactic moment in the second discourse when he introduces the concept of perfectibility. It is an odd word for Rousseau to use, or rather it functions as something like camouflage, or a ruse, for his intellectual public, who all presumably have a firm belief in human progress. But it is not the ideas. We already know, from the position of the second discourse itself, that Rousseau is far from believing in perfectibility in any conventional sense that we need to analyze. It is rather his reasoning shape, and the sequence of ideas into which it is inserted, that offer a more significant clue to everything unique and peculiar about Rousseau. In a first mention, indeed, Rousseau endorses the commonplace view that it is perfectibility that distinguishes human beings from animals. At that point, we are astonished by a perverse and characteristic association of ideas, for in the next sentence, Rousseau asks, "Why is man alone liable to become imbecile?" He neither lists the positive achievements that would normally document the claim of perfectibility, nor narrates the stages whereby man rises from an animal condition to an ever more perfected state. It is true that he will tell that story later on, but for a rather different, we may even say Lévi-Straussian purpose, namely to show that history and what we call civilization need never have taken place. That what we call perfectibility is the result of a series of accidents. That perfectibility, the social virtues, and the other faculties which natural man had received in potentiality could never develop by themselves. That in order to do so, they needed the fortuitous concatenation of several foreign causes which might never have arisen, and without which he would eternally have remained in his primitive condition. But I read this somewhat differently than Lévi-Strauss does, although the latter remains the appropriate reference, and we'll come back to this difference shortly. For the moment, and returning to the initial passage already quoted, in which Rousseau associates man's perfectibility with his devolution into old age and senility, I want to observe that in his reflection on the matter, Rousseau characteristically isolates the form rather than the content of the idea of perfectibility. He sets aside the positive valence of the latter, retaining only the formal identity of perfectibility with change or history. And this is all the more astonishing inasmuch as the ethical judgment, the eudaimonic framework in which notions of attraction and repulsion, pleasure and pain, good and bad, come into play. This framework will be the indispensable framework of the second discourse as a whole, which reaches the well-known conclusion that civilization and civil society are harmful states which generate class inequalities. What then is this faculty of judgment suspended in the passage that immediately concerns us, to the point where not even the paradoxical effect of illustrating perfectibility with senility is allowed to distract us? The fact is that Rousseau is not interested in what will later on, in part 2, be his fundamental conclusion. He is not here interested in judgment or content. Rather, he is intent on observing the abstract form of historical change itself. And it is at this point that I would wish to specify Lévi-Strauss's interpretation more sharply, yet very much in his spirit. For it seems to me that here Rousseau anticipates that great discovery which remains associated with Lévi-Strauss's name and work, namely the distinction between the synchronic and the diachronic. The diachronic, change in history, is neither meaningful nor thinkable. It is the result of a series of accidents. Only the synchronic, here the famous state of nature, is thinkable and meaningful. Only the synchronic has genuine content, while the diachronic is an abstract sequence of events whose content or meaning is variable and lacks necessity. Clearly enough, this is the point at which it would be appropriate to raise the issue of narrative as such, the issue of causalities, of telling the story of this sequence of meaningless events, or indeed, in Lévi-Strauss's system, of transforming such a sequence into a narrative myth, in which meaning is generated by borrowing terms and oppositions from the synchronic as such. But that is not my topic here, for I have only wanted to use this brief passage in order to demonstrate the way in which Rousseau is prepared to follow his own thinking into the unthinkable. Let me now offer a much larger and more dramatic illustration of this process, in which confidence in reasoning leads the thinker on fearlessly into a cul-de-sac. It is the famous digression on the origin of language, not to be confused with Rousseau's later and equally unsuccessful attempt to confront this problem in a fragment henceforth rendered famous by Jacques Derrida's commentary in the Grammatology, but which exceeds the discussion in the second discourse by raising the additional issues of writing, climate, music, and the like. What the proportionally considerable digression in the second discourse offers is the astonishing spectacle of a reasoning so self-punishing in the demands it makes on itself that it renders the problem insoluble, and in effect incapacitates itself. Let me be allowed briefly to consider the perplexities regarding the origin of languages. The digression is an enlargement of the discussion of the emergence of thinking and abstract ideas among those natural beings who only know needs and passions and do not as yet think any more than they speak. I summarize the various obstacles which Rousseau places in the way of thinking the emergence of language. 1. Why language should have been necessary in the first place. 2. How abstract meanings could ever have been communicated. 3. How the cry as such could have been domesticated and articulated in such a way as to serve the needs of everyday life. 4. How propositions and sentences could have emerged from that first form of language, which was the individual word. 5. How general terms could have emerged from names of individual things. 6. A more concentrated summary of all of the above, involving the distinction between the intellect and the imagination. This moment will also be the point of departure for Lévi-Strauss's theory of pensée sauvage. Hence one has to state propositions. Hence one has to speak in order to have general ideas, for as soon as the imagination stops, the mind can proceed only by means of discourse. If, then, the first inventors could give names only to the ideas they already had, it follows that the first substantives could never have been anything but proper names. At this point, Rousseau breaks it off. By means which I cannot conceive, I pause after these first steps. As for myself, frightened by the increasing difficulties, and convinced of the almost demonstrated impossibility that languages could have arisen and been established by purely human means, I leave to anyone who wishes to undertake it the discussion of this difficult problem. And finally, quoi qu'il en soit de ces origines, whatever may be the case regarding these origins. Rousseau has talked himself out of his own illustration. By the peculiar power of the reasoning proper to him, and which is at present our object of study, he has so effectively multiplied the problems involved in thinking the origin of languages that he has proven to his own satisfaction that they could not have come into being in the first place. It is no doubt a comic spectacle, akin to being too smart for your own good. But there is something salutary in the shock as well, and something temporally perverse and retroactive, with a kind of family likeness to Freud's Nachtragkeit. The point is that the event to be modelled has already happened. We are in the process of foretelling the past, predicting what already exists behind us, as it were, framing a guilty man. And the shock lies in the fact that the most airtight reasoning proves that it could never have happened in the first place. Thus, in the gap between our reasoning and the facts, a mystery suddenly emerges, fully blown, which is the mystery of time and of historicity, the mystery of the event itself as a scandal and a stumbling block. The apparent discovery that we cannot think the diachronic does not abolish history, nor, as Lévi-Strauss believed, does it discredit historical thought. On the contrary, it establishes history for the first time in all its arresting freshness and unpredictability. The flight of the owl returns upon the world of daylight to confer a grisly clarity upon it, in which every leaf stands out without a shadow. This is then an altogether remarkable outcome, which surely does not demonstrate the weakness of Rousseau's capacity for thought and his philosophical abilities, so much as it exhibits their very power, and his frightening resolve to follow his own reasoning wherever it leads him. A peculiar enough character trait to find in so inveterate a daydreamer and fantasist. I see several ways of interpreting this peculiarity. One will predictably be the reading of Lévi-Strauss, on which we have already touched several times, and which again rehearses the opposition between the synchronic and the diachronic. But in the present context, this opposition takes on unusual content. First of all, we confront the obvious fact that no one ever has accounted for the origins of language. This has to do, at least in part, with the absence of anthropological data, but it should be noted that Rousseau himself takes into account just such scientific lacunae. Comparative anatomy has as yet made too little progress, etc. And the linguistic paradox is given yet another twist by virtue of this very absence, which results from the necessary non-existence of writing in such an early period. But Lévi-Strauss's position is not merely an agonistic one. He affirms that language could never have come into being piecemeal, gradually, bit by bit, beginning with the cry and the gesture, and slowly passing into articulated sounds, and so forth. Rather, as a synchronic system, language had to appear all at once, complete and fully developed, a requirement that may well make the origins of language even more unthinkable than they were in Rousseau. But we may also come at this from the vantage point of another reader of Rousseau, this time a follower from his own century, for whom the reading of Jean-Jacques was fully as decisive, Immanuel Kant. For was not at least one of Kant's great discoveries the conclusion that the human mind is constitutionally limited in what it can think and in its proper objects? And is this not one of the most dramatic lessons of Rousseau's procedures here? That when making the most rigorous demands on itself, the mind sometimes comes up short against the unthinkable. The conclusion Kant draws from this lesson, indeed, is the impossibility of thinking about origins. The first paralogism in the Critique of Pure Reason, or in other words, the antinomy of pure reason, the world has a beginning in time, the world has no beginning, etc. But as with language in Rousseau, this is not exactly a false problem. For clearly enough, like language, the world did have a beginning, inasmuch as it exists. What is at stake is not the evident fact, but our capacity to think it in any adequate way. Yet, somehow both these readings, and Rousseau himself, tend to affirm the impossibility, if not of history, then at least of historical thinking. And this is very clearly the consequence Lévi-Strauss draws in his famous polemic with Sartre. I want to suggest a somewhat different conclusion, which will affirm Rousseau's relationship to the then emergent dialectic, and to dialectical thinking as such. For it seems to me that what his thinking arrives at, as its momentary terminus, is neither impossibility nor diachronic incoherence, nor is it the antinomy as such, but rather contradiction, the very motor power of the dialectic itself. But let's now, in conclusion, try to see this at work in the eminently political text, namely the social contract. Here it is not so much a question of the origin of that bad thing, civilization, or civil society in its history, as of that second best thing, which is the social contract in its most vigorous and uncorrupted form, as it succeeds the so-called state of nature. The idea of the contract, that is to say, Rousseau's motivation in re-theorizing it, since it is itself a very ancient idea, Rousseau's interest in the idea of the contract must be explored in several directions. One, and it is the great originality of this unique text, lies in the production of a new mental category, that of a relationship between the individual and the collective, which is neither that of simple homology. The collectivity is simply the individual writ larger. It is a collective subject of some kind. Nor that of an aggregate of individuals, a single individual multiplied in such a way that notions of majority, plurality, minority, and so on are ontologically relevant. Indeed, Rousseau wishes to establish something like a radical ontological difference between the individual and the collective whole, without the existence of any mediating groups or instances. Does he succeed in achieving this new category of thought, which would be, if it existed, distinct in form from oppositions like universal and particular, or general and individual? The answer has never been clear or definitive, and the negative judgment that the exclusion of factionalism and intermediate groups is simply totalitarian, an accusation powerfully reinforced by the Jacobin practice of Rousseau's idea, is as plausible as it is contradicted by the text. For one of the other purposes of the social contract is to exclude the idea that a people can contract into slavery or voluntarily accept tyranny. The inalienability of freedom then gives content to and poses limits on the consequences of the contract as such, and inscribes the right to rebel in human nature. But what interests us here, in the present context, is rather the slippage of the idea of the contract. It was designed to identify the deep structure of that social contract which replaced the state of nature, in such a way that disparities between the original contract and an increasingly corrupt modern society are underscored. Here, as always, there is a confusion and an interference between the political and the economic. Is the degradation of modern society the result of private property, as the second discourse affirms? Whoever first said, "This is mine." Or is it, as the language of the social contract seems to imply, a matter of freedom and its loss? This second possibility would seem to be more a cultural or superstructural consequence, a waning of the consciousness of some original freedom, rather than, as with private property, the institution of new kinds of infrastructural constraints. Two rather different revolutionary solutions would then be implied by the alternative. But I want to focus on the fact that either seems to imply a solution. That is to say, that the idea of an original contract seems fatally to suggest the possibility of returning to it, and of somehow rectifying the present fallen state of society. In fact, in another part of his mind, Rousseau would seem to be convinced that a revival of the contract is possible only under very specific conditions, which in modern times only rarely obtain. The project for a constitution for Corsica, the considerations on the government of Poland, and Part 3 of the social contract underscore the unique historical opportunities of these two areas, still relatively uncorrupted by modern society, whose inhabitants still retain something of the vigor and independence of the simpler mountain tribes of ancient Switzerland, say. Indeed, the weaknesses of Corsica and Poland in the modern world are precisely their social strengths when it comes to a return to the virtues and strengths of an older Spartan state. To be sure, they are quite different weaknesses. In Corsica, underdevelopment; in Poland, feudal decentralization and Russian oppression. As for the so-called advanced nations of Western Europe, however, they are incorrigible, and no return to societal health or to the original contract is to be fantasized for them. We can already guess from this pessimism the presence of that mental operation we have already underscored, an attempt to fantasize which is at every step interrupted and blocked by a kind of reality principle of the imagination itself, which combines its demands with an insistence on the difficulties of constructing the fantasy in the first place, and finally multiplies them to the point at which it talks itself out of the very possibility of conceiving an optimistic projection altogether. We do not, however, have to deduce the operation of this characteristic process in Rousseau. We can observe it again in detail at one specific point, namely that moment in the social contract when Rousseau describes the inauguration of the contract itself and the agency whereby it is brought into being. I have already observed that Rousseau's formulations waver between base and superstructure, so to speak, between institutions and cultural habits, between the laws of the city and the practices and daily life of its inhabitants. At his weakest, he makes this hesitation, this alternation, visible as an inconsistency. At his strongest, he insists on the political necessity of uniting the two in a kind of cultural revolution. Meanwhile, and very much in the spirit of the Althusserian reading of the Manifesto as a form, he will not be content until he drives his imagination on to the very point of origin itself, and confronts the necessity of grasping the agency responsible for the foundation of the new system. This agency is still an individual one, like Machiavelli's Prince, and it lies in the past, as a historical act of foundation which is certainly exemplary and perhaps inimitable. Everyone who has absorbed the atmosphere of neoclassical 18th century political culture and has confronted the inescapable reference to Sparta in it will scarcely be surprised by the looming presence, in this discourse, of Lycurgus, the mythic founder. Plutarch's life then takes its place alongside Plato's Republic as one of the fundamental utopian texts, something like the life of Utopus himself, whose inauguration of the perfect commonwealth is, in more, shrouded in mystery, not least because, like Lycurgus himself, he then seems to have programmed himself out of the system, if not out of history and legend. Meanwhile, Heidegger assures us that the founding of a state is, along with the work of art, the philosophical concept, and the ominously named essential sacrifice, one of the fundamental places of truth and of the disclosure of being. Rousseau observes all this with characteristic, and we may even say remorseless lucidity. But given his method, as we have just outlined it, he arrives at a somewhat different perspective on the conclusion. We may translate this method into contemporary terms as follows. Rousseau's reasoning is the reconstruction of history in thought. It is neither a historiographic narrative nor a historical representation exactly, something we can verify by comparing that first part of the Discourse on Inequality, of which we have already spoken, with the second, in which he attempts to recuperate his losses and paper over the extraordinary train of reasoning of the first, with the far more conventional historical story of the stages of the emergence of civil society and class injustice. Rather, it seems to me more appropriate to compare Rousseau's procedure, the reconstruction of historical development by way of presuppositions and preconditions, with what Althusser called the concrete in thought, a non-representational mode which often has surprises in store for us. Let's follow the process in the case of Rousseau's reconstruction of Plutarch's Lycurgus. We are warned of the looming thunderclouds of paradox and antimony by the opening sentence, which posits the need, in the founder, of une intelligence supérieure qui vit toutes les passions des hommes et qui n'en éprouva aucune. Rousseau is very clear that the transformation of human nature itself, as he says, means the end of the individual and the creation, in his place, of the group itself. Meanwhile, this rare and unusual process requires a very distinctive kind of agency. The lawgiver cannot impose his new constitution either by force or by rank or position. A strict differentiation must be established between conventional rules and their offices and this one. Si celui qui commande aux hommes ne doit pas commander aux lois, celui qui commande aux lois ne doit pas non plus commander aux hommes. It would have been worth pausing here to note the emergence in Rousseau of that trope of the dialectical chiasmus, which is omnipresent in Marx, and which is indeed the sign and symptom of a whole new mode of thinking. At any rate, it is clear that the lawgiver, the founder of the state, cannot himself be an individual exactly. It is the inverse and the logical concomitant of the social contract. The people as a whole must function as something more and other than a collection of individuals, while the individual who sets the contract in place must stand outside that collection and in no way constitute a part of the whole of which he is the godlike cause. Thus, just as the collectivity of the social contract requires a new conceptual category, different in kind from either that of the individual or that of the multiple, so also the founder must be conceptualized in a new way. Ainsi, concludes Rousseau, l'on trouve à la fois dans l'ouvrage de la législation deux choix qui sont incompatibles, une entreprise au-dessus de la force humaine et, pour l'exécuter, une autorité qui n'est rien. We who thus find two seemingly incompatible things in the work of legislation, an enterprise beyond all human powers, and for its execution, an authority which is nothing. Were we to continue our juxtaposition of Rousseau with the thinking of modern structuralism, we would be inclined to feel that Rousseau has here discovered the essentials of what Lévi-Strauss calls a myth, namely, a figure which unites incompatible seams or signifying traits. I would thus conclude that Rousseau has, as with the invention of language, proven that Sparta never was founded, and indeed could never have existed in the first place. But now I want to draw a further conclusion from this conclusion, that what Rousseau has discovered here, if he has not indeed invented it, is what will shortly, in the emergent dialectical tradition, be called a contradiction, what is incompatible and ultimately unthinkable. That this has something to do with fantasy production and his inclination toward daydreaming, I have already hinted. And perhaps I can theorize that connection by evoking the reality principle within fantasy itself, and the rigorousness with which a certain daydreaming makes demands on itself and attempts to secure the conditions of possibility of its own fantasies and daydreams. At any rate, it is that peculiar rigor which we find here, and which impels Rousseau toward the implacable undoing of his own fantasies, in contradiction as such. Meanwhile, this is no ordinary contradiction, insofar as it has as its object history and temporality. Here, indeed, is the revolutionary vicious circle which the mystery of the founder and the contradictory myth of Lycurgus contains within itself. In order for an emergent people to enjoy the healthy maxims of politics, and to follow the fundamental rules of the state's reason, the untranslatable raison d'etat, it would be necessary for the effect to become the cause, and for the social spirit which was to have resulted from this institutionalization to have presided over the founding of the institution itself. In other words, for men to have been before law what they were to become by virtue of its existence. It is an astonishing conclusion, in no way vitiated by the feeble Enlightenment appeal to persuasion and reason by which Rousseau attempts to cut his Gordian knot and solve his irresolvable problems. So Rousseau was not only the impossible founder of structuralism, he was the equally impossible founder of the dialectic itself. He was not only the discoverer of the tension between synchrony and diachrony, he also stumbled upon that necessity of the dialectic which is rooted in the historicity of language itself. I have often, to this effect, quoted the extraordinary footnote in Émile on the relationship between words and modes of production. But it would be enough to return to the second discourse to observe the same dialectical lucidity at work in his frequent identifications of anachronism in the language of his philosophical opponents. What can the word misery mean when applied to the state of nature? He responds to Hobbes. Explain to me what the word oppression means in such a state, he adds. And finally, how could the words power and reputation have any significance for those people you call savages? This is the other face of the opposition between the synchronic and the diachronic. It reflects the secret historicity of this apparently historical and anti-historical opposition, the history revealed by the inapplicability of the elements of our own synchronicity, our own historical system, to a radically different one. So it is that Rousseau discovers revolution as the unthinkable gap between two systems, the untheorizable break between two distinct synchronicities. Perhaps it would be enough to evoke a contemporary rediscovery of that mystery, such as Antonio Negri's notion of constituent power, to glimpse again the positive energies that begin to emanate from this seemingly negative and self-defeating act of thought. I believe that political thinking is to be surprised here, as it were, in its moment of emergence, and by that very method of the implacable reduction to conditions of possibility, which was Rousseau's own historical invention.